the Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Moggcast. I'm Mark Wallace, the executive editor of conservativehome.com. I'm here with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this isn't just any old Common or Garden Moggcast anymore. This is now officially the Guardian's podcast of the week. The Moggcast describes rather generously, I think, as surprisingly listenable by that newspaper, Jacob. So I hope you're pleased at the response that you're getting.
I think it's very generous of the Guardian, because I can't imagine my views cheer them up when they listen. So I think it's noble of them, actually, to say that they like listening to it.
One person who perhaps isn't so keen on always listening to your views appears to be Anna Soubry, your parliamentary colleague, who I think describes you and some others last week as, quote, not proper Conservatives, and called for you to be slung out of the Conservative Party even over your views on Brexit. How did that go down with your colleagues, would you say?
Anna has passionate views about the European Union, which she has always had. And I think it is right that people should be free within the Conservative Party to express their strength of opinion. The Tory party is, in that old cliché, a broad church. It's very important that people like Anna and Ken Clarke and me and John Redwood can remain within the same party. There are many things on which we will agree, and obviously the ones on which we don't agree are the most newsworthy and the most exciting. But I think she's absolutely entitled to make the case she wishes to make. And she is a formidably capable public operator. So not only does she do it, but she does it well.
Do you ever get that feeling that perhaps she would be happier in another party? Not the question of sleeing out, but the question of whether she's really kind of comfortable where she is.
I don't think so. I think she's been a member of the Conservative Party for a long time, and that all the time she's been in the party, there have been some people who've had her views and some people who've held my views. I think the Conservative Party does require that breadth, because there's no monopoly on wisdom on either side of any debate, and that both sides can bring things to it, and that as long as there are basic underlying principles on which you agree and you believe in a state built from the bottom up and not a top-down state as the socialist would, if you believe in free enterprise, there's so much common ground with Conservatives that I think we shouldn't always focus on what we disagree on.
Certainly, and that history you talked about of the fact there have always been these different competing strands, obviously two broad competing strands on this particular topic of the European Union. One other thing that Anna asserted in her interview is that for the first time ever there are people on the Tory benches determined to stop Eurosceptics getting their way. That seemed a little bit surprising to me. I mean, you've been around the European battles within the Conservative Party for a fair while. How does the balance feel now?
Well, there have always been people on both sides, right the way back to the first application to join under Harold Macmillan. So I think this isn't new. I think it's the continuation of a long-running vision for how the country is going to be most prosperous, most successful, and most democratic, and that both sides have valid points to make. The country in the referendum came down on one side rather than the other, but in 1975 it came down on the other side. And so I think it's important that we do discuss this and essentially, and in the end, trust the people to decide.
It seems to me, certainly, that looking at even how Conservative home readers have shifted over the years, there's a bit of a stereotype that home readers are all very, very right-wing within the Conservative Party, and actually our own surveys seem to show that they're rather warmer about David Cameron, for example, than perhaps Conservative voters were on average, certainly than Conservative MPs always were. But the Tory party's grassroots seem to have shifted pretty decisively on this question of Europe. I mean, I'm not sure that there's the grassroots base that perhaps the European movement and others once had.
Well, Ted Heath was an enormously popular leader of the party when he took the UK into the European Union. That had a widespread following within the Conservative Party. Margaret Thatcher was loved within the Conservative Party for being robust towards Europe. So that the party does shift around. I think more Conservatives are now Eurosceptic than not, but then the country is now more Eurosceptic than not. There is a big shift from 1975 to 2016, with the huge majority in favour of staying in 1975, shifting to a comfortable majority to leave in 2016, and that inevitably will be reflected within the Conservative Party.
And one other grassroots kind of divide, as you were just talking about, is the traditional Tory suspicion of the centre of the party. So, once upon a time the party was not really one political party. It was just a collection of hundreds of associations around the country. Over time that's been more centralised, and there's a bit of a debate, a battle even going on at the minute, isn't there, about how how things like candidate selection should be run, what kind of democratic control there is within the party. The
Conservative Party, centrally, has always had a peculiar view about the localities. But as a general rule, the Conservative Party believes that things are best done on the local level, that we believe in society built up by individuals forming communities, forming associations, and running their own affairs. This is how we think things should run for the country at large. When it comes to the party, we all think, or Central Office seems to think, it should be decided by imperial fiat sent down from what used to be Smith Square and is now Matthew Parker Street. And it's very odd, and it's not in line with Conservative thinking. The power, the strength, the work of the Conservative Party is in its local roots. And what we should be doing is reinvigorating that, not thinking that it can all be done by a few computers in Central Office.
What was your own path to selection like? Did you have any difficulties with the centre? It seems you don't necessarily fit the stereotype of what the Conservative Party said it was looking for at that time.
Well, no, this is one of the reasons I think local associations should be free to choose, because you then do get a variety of views within the party. And as I said, there's no monopoly of wisdom on one side or the other. But my agent was told that before the final selection round, she could have any candidate she liked as long as his name wasn't Rees-Mogg or her name.
So the opposite of the Model T Ford colour choice.
That's right, absolutely right. No, the Central Office was very keen to stop me being selected at every stage. Fortunately, Michael Ancram was the MP sitting in on the SIFT in Central Office. And when they were saying to my association, oh, you can't have Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they said, oh, yes, we can, Michael Ancram came down on their side. And that's how I got through in the first place. But they continue to put pressure on to stop my selection. And I think this is undemocratic. I think local associations should have more power and the centre less. And I hope that the proposals to give more power to the centre will be voted down.
What, in your view, can be done? If you're a Conservative Party member listening to the Moggcast right now, what can you do to stop this kind of centralisation? What can you do to take a bit of power, take back control, as it were?
Tell your association chairman at the convention not to vote in favour of the rule changes that on this specific area. Some rule changes may well be perfectly sensible, but in terms of centralising candidate selection further, that would be a great mistake. It should in fact be reversed and more localised. It would be very bad for associations if they didn't maintain two things. One is the right to elect the leader, and the other is the right to select a candidate. That's perhaps those are the two most important things that people get as members: real tangible authority within the party, democracy within the party. And if that were lost, I think you'd find many members saying, why do I belong?
Well, particularly if you're left only with the generous offer of a £25 tea towel to buy from time to time.
Well, some people might think that's very exciting and good value.
Indeed. On a totally separate note, the other day you ambushed Sky News in Downing Street. I think it's fair to say on the topic of international aid. Tell us about your incident with them.
Well, I didn't ambush them at all. I had a long-standing arrangement with the Daily Express to present the petition from their readers on overseas aid. And Faisal Islam, who I see quite a bit of inevitably because he's round and about in Westminster and is both very charming and exceptionally knowledgeable. So he saw me presenting this petition and called over to me, will you come and have a word? So inevitably I had a word. It would have been rude not to.
And obviously since that, we've seen this horrendous story blow up about Oxfam, about some other charities and international agencies. Do you think this is something that's going to make a difference on the question of aid, or do you think it's something that people simply separate out? The behaviour of one organisation doesn't reflect on the wider budget?
Well, I thought there was a very good piece on Conservative Home this morning on this issue and about charities becoming too dependent on government funding. I think by and large charities should raise their money privately in the charitable sector, and government should by and large, not invariably, spend its money directly under government control, because otherwise the charities essentially become subsets of government. Their main purpose is to be a delivery arm, in that awful jargon, of government, rather than being independent charities seeking what is best in terms of their charitable objectives. And you get, I think, an unhealthy relationship, because charities are funded by the government, they're regulated by the government, by the Charities Commission. What are they actually doing that is different from that which is being done by the government? What is its purpose? And so I think it would be good to see a review of how government money is spent. But I also think the overseas aid budget target is an error, that we should spend money sensibly, with a good audit trail, when it is needed. To say we will simply spend this money and we will spend it by the end of the year as a percentage of a figure that we do not know, so we're guessing at the end of the year and can be shoveling money out of the door to meet the target, that's a great mistake. And what should we do instead? Well, I think there's a really interesting opportunity that we could carry on helping in emergencies, which most people in the country think is a good thing to do. I think the country should be very proud of the work the UK has done in terms of refugee camps near Syria, where we've been, second only to the United States, the biggest contributor to those, to try and solve the problem near where it arises, rather than encouraging large numbers of refugees. But perhaps we should look, and this is my investment interest, in investment rather than in expenditure. That if you look at overseas aid, it pales in comparison with the flows going from the private sector. I think the figures are between 800 billion, and $1 trillion each year go from the private sector into emerging markets. But that's investment and seeking a return. And I wonder whether the government ought to think about investing, as it does through the Commonwealth Development Corporation, and seeking a long-term return, and perhaps building up a sovereign wealth fund through the expenditure that's already committing. And that might be better value for the British taxpayer, achieve better outcomes for the poorest countries in the world, because investing with a return is often a more useful way of spending money than giving it to the Ethiopian Spice Girls or whatever temporary here today, gone tomorrow project you've decided to back. If the target is to be set in stone, it would go towards that target. It might not meet the technical rules, but it would go towards that target. And so I think there is another approach to overseas aid that could be taken.
So, by extension, does that mean that the campaign around the millennium for debt relief, for example, for the developing world, was a mistake?
The debt relief question is a really difficult one, because the moral imperative to offer debt relief to very poor countries is strong and therefore is welcome. But, and there is a but, the poorest countries in the world weren't able to borrow in the first place because nobody ever thought they could pay back. So the debt relief didn't actually benefit the very, very poorest countries. It benefited ones that were a little bit above that. Now, benefiting them is not a bad thing, but if there's a limited budget, you have to work out who do you want to benefit. Is it the poorest or the next poorest? And so there has to be a debate on how money is spent. And sometimes I have the feeling that money is spent to achieve a headline rather than having thought through precisely what the benefits are.
It's a question of press release by taxpayers' cash.
That's right, yes.
Here's the tricky question, I think, for parts of particularly the right of the Conservative Party, of which I probably count myself as a member. We can be uncomfortable about the 0.7% requirement, that target, as something for international development spending. But we all tend to simultaneously find ourselves quite enthusiastic about the 2% target for NATO spending. Is this not something for defence spending required by NATO? Is that not somewhat inconsistent?
It is, and therefore I'm not in favour of setting a target for defence spending. I think it's the wrong approach. I think we should set defence spending according to the needs of the nation. And I think the needs of the nation are slightly higher than current defence spending rather than slightly lower. But I don't think that's in relation to the 2% target. I completely agree with you. Hypothecated expenditure and hypothecated taxation are a bad way to manage government.
So when Gavin Williamson says, I think as he did in his first Commons outing as Defence Secretary, that the 2% he sees as a floor, not a ceiling, that equally is perhaps the wrong way to be?
Well, it's perfectly reasonable to say at the moment the requirements on the defence budget are such that we need at least 2%. But to say that every year, regardless of what happens, we will always need 2% is wrong. And it is also, as he said in making that point, a problem, because if you set it at 2%, it's deemed to be 2% even if that's too little. So you always get the wrong amount by setting a target. You either get too little or you get too much. It will only be by pure good luck that 2% is absolutely the right amount.
In the case of both debates, you have quite a strong, certainly quite a lobby that's viewed with quite a lot of affection in the media and in various parts of the public, be it aid workers around the world. One's intentions, certainly overall, that the people broadly recognise are good, or be it for that matter, the recent development of lobbyists in uniform, effectively, with generals and so on. Are politicians equipped to kind of deal with people who are seen as a little bit above criticism?
It's a very interesting point, and the growth of lobbying in the last 40, 50 years has had a very important effect on government and the behaviour of public servants, because 50 years ago, generals did not speak out and say, we need more money, when they were still serving. Judges didn't give speeches except from the bench. But because everybody else is lobbying, they've joined in as well. I think the job of politicians is to represent the interests of the nation as a whole, but that we live in a world where sectional interest will be made and will be made loudly. And I don't see that changing, and I don't think it's something that it would be easy or even probably right for the government to try to change. But the government is there for the nation as a whole and has to make the case that there are many important spending priorities. And when you decide, you have to look at the options. What do? You raise taxation. But currently, tax as a percentage of GDP is as high as it's been since the late 60s, early 70s. There's very little extra room for taxation. The top 1% are paying 27% of all income tax. So putting taxes up won't raise very much more money. You could borrow more. But we all know that borrowing is simply delayed taxation, so it may not be collected today, but it has to be collected at some point. You could move money around from one priority to another. So you could say, well, we'll spend less on schools and have more for defence. But then the school budget's under threat. So you say you'll spend less on overseas aid, but overseas aid won't pay for everything. It's 0.7% of GDP. Even if you cut it to zero, that money would quickly be absorbed by other higher spending departments. And governments have to point out to the electorate that there are these difficult choices to make, and the electorate must then decide who it wants to make these difficult choices. Does it want Jeremy Corbyn in his never, never land of the ever-growing money tree, or does it want the Conservatives who are actually quite good at making hard choices? But we've got to recognise that there aren't easy answers. There isn't more money for everything. And people like us, on the broadly the right of the spectrum, need to be careful about asking for more money for defence without having some idea of where it's going to come from. I mean, a little raid on the overseas aid budget might help, but this is not to do with the 2% target, it's to do with the amount fundamentally that we need to spend on defence.
So if it isn't possible to put back in their bottle, say, some of the generals who are lobbying, or the police chiefs, I think Theresa May suffered at Prime Minister's Questions last week when Jeremy Corbyn was able to quote various chief constables. If it isn't possible to put them back in their bottle, is it at least possible, do you think, in the instance of this horrendous aid scandal, to take on some of those vested interests? Would you like to see, for example, Penny Mordaunt tell Oxfam, no more taxpayers' money given your behaviour?
Well, I think Oxfam should raise its money in the private sector, and the government should spend its money more directly. I think far too much is done through agencies, and then there is very little control of it. And the government then is held responsible when there's a scandal anyway. The arm's length relationship doesn't end up helping the government. And you may say that there would be duplication and that it's cheaper to spend the money via Oxfam, but I'm not convinced that that's true. I'm not sure that the controls are in place. But certainly Oxfam should be held to account for these scandals.
And we've only got a few minutes left, so the final thing I wanted to touch on really was we've had a lot of questions since the last episode of the Moggcast about your experience in Bristol with the arrival of masked thugs at an event that you were due to speak at. What's it actually like when people kind of burst in the door and start shouting you down, hiding their faces, calling you a fascist, and that kind of thing? What's it, the kind of first-person Jacob Rees-Mogg experience of that happening?
Well, I mean, I've always taken the view, I'm afraid, from the nursery, that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words can never harm me. And therefore, if people are shouting rude comments at you, why should I mind? That they can't have any very strong arguments if all they can do is shout abuse. And I tried to discuss what they were concerned about with them, and they could only shout. They had no interest in discussing any of the important issues of the day. And that shows you the intolerance, mindlessness of the hard left, or perhaps the poseur hard left, because the best comment came from the leading protester's grandmother, who said that he was a very naughty boy and that she had hoped he'd been beginning to mature, but clearly he hadn't. And I think that rather indicated that it was a sort of poseur revolutionary and not to be taken too seriously.
But you do a little bit more than turn the other cheek. I think we saw this in Manchester as well. You went straight over to actually try to have words and see if they would exchange their views. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words may never hurt you. How are you entirely confident they don't have sticks and stones? I mean,
yes. I mean, that's not what these sorts of protests are about. They're about shouting somebody down. They're not hired thugs. They're not people who wish to cause physical harm. They were very keen to ensure that they stayed on the right side of the law. They didn't want to be breaking the law, as far as I could tell. So no, I felt in no physical danger on any of the occasions when I've gone up to speak to protesters.
And we saw, sadly, last week reports that at least half a dozen prominent Leave campaign donors have received death threats, allegedly. Do you know anyone who's been threatened in that way?
Well, I've seen on the Conservative MPs WhatsApp group this morning that a number of Conservative MPs have received these threats. I think this is in a different league, and it's why I've been keen to contextualise what happened to me as not particularly serious. Some of the abuse people receive, particularly women MPs online, the threats of death and physical violence, is much more threatening and frightening than anything that's happened to me. And who knows who are sending out these death threats to Leave supporting MPs and to Leave supporting donors, but they do themselves a great discredit, and the full force of the law should be brought down upon them.
Is there a question of political culture? Some people point to the referendum and say that this is an outcome of having a referendum on such a big topic, is that now everybody's divided and nobody gets on. Does that ever reflect and make you think there was an error, or was an error in how the campaigns were managed, or do you think it's something that's happening in a wider political context?
No, I think that there has always been an element within politics that gets very angry. I remember John Prescott in the 2001 election having an egg thrown at him, and Lord Prescott responding forcefully. And in a way, actually, most of the country thought was perfectly reasonable. That if you go back to Spencer Perceval being assassinated, he was being assassinated, or Bellingham, who killed him, had gone bankrupt because he didn't like Perceval's trade policy. And there has always been strong feeling within politics which at the margins can flip over into violence and aggression. I don't think we're any worse in this generation than we have been before.
Really? Because you see, for example, after the hounding of the former Haringey council leader, Claire Cober, you heard some prominent Corbynite podcasters, in fact, kind of joking, saying, she's dead, in a light-hearted way. At the same time, you see people turning up with masks and you hear death threats being sent to people's houses. This doesn't seem like a change for the worse? Well,
look what was happening in the 1980s, when the militant tendency was hounding out MPs, trying to deselect them, when Keith Joseph couldn't go to a university without practically a riot around his car as he arrived, when the miners' strike degenerated into violence, with certainly attempted murders taking place. Somebody, do you remember, had a large lump of concrete dropped on their car from a motorway bridge. And that was a political issue. That was disorder over a political issue, the poll tax riots. We haven't got any of that. So there is often a tendency, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody, to look at the past and think everything was better then. Actually, when you begin to remember some of the details, it was probably worse, and that's before you think that most politicians in the UK in the 1980s of any seniority needed close protection because of the IRA.
Is there a responsibility, or indeed any direct responsibility, for politicians like John McDonnell when they say that rioters are, quote, the best of our movement, or they praise the bombs and the bullets of the IRA, that people who perhaps agree with them then go on to act in this way?
I wouldn't have the cause and effect link. I don't think that's easy to show. But yes, I think John McDonnell is very, very irresponsible and frightening in the way he calls for insurrection, he approves of insurrection. If he ever became Chancellor of the Exchequer, then you should be very worried that the levers of power that the state had would be used to make sure that the levers of power were never taken out of the hard left's hands again. That's how they've operated within the Labour Party, that's how they operate within councils. If he became Chancellor and Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister, that's how they would behave at a national level. And so his truthfulness is a very good recruiting sergeant for the Conservatives, because I think the Corbyn-McDonnell alliance is the most hard left alliance you've had at the top of the Labour Party in its history, and would therefore be the greatest risk to our institutional structures if they were ever in control.
And on that note, Jacob, we're out of time for this episode of the Moggcast. Thank you very much, as ever, for joining us. Thank you to all of you around the country, tens of thousands of people now listening. I hope you'll remember to click to subscribe and join us next time for the Moggcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.